Today, however, I'm pleased to introduce Christopher Roos, who's going to be talking to us about research that he's been carrying out also in the Southwest in Arizona on fire and fire regimes and changing vegetational communities. He's an environmental archaeologist at Southern Methodist University, and he has primary research interests in the long-term interactions between climate change, human land use, and landscape fires. And he's been investigating the ways that Native American communities in the pine forests of the Southwest have adapted to various climate regimes. And today, Chris will bring archaeological, dendrochronological, and paleoecological information together to examine human and climatic impacts of Arizona's fire-prone forests over the last millennium in order to illuminate pathways towards more resilient fire-climate society relationships in the present and the future. Thanks for being with us today, Chris.
Thank you, Karen. It's my pleasure to be here and have a chance to share some of the work that I've been doing. I hope that there may be some tidbits of information that people in the audience can find of value or at least find to be of interest. What I'd like to talk about today is work that I did primarily associated with my PhD work while I was a student at the University of Arizona, and used that as kind of a lead-in to work that I'm doing now in the southern Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico, basically the southern part of the landscape that Craig Allen will probably be talking about next week. And fire is interesting from an anthropological standpoint because fire scholars have wrestled for the better part of a century with very simplified questions about the relationship between people, fire, and the landscape. You know, really only asking the question about whether or not fire in the environment was a natural phenomenon or if it was in fact cultural. And as the fire folks, and I notice that there's some fire folks in the audience, probably know from the history of fire management policies in the U.S., this was a framing part of that debate as well. Now today we have a much better idea that about the long-term historical context of fire. Wildfires have been present just about as long as we've had land plants on Earth. The oldest charcoal as evidence of fire and incomplete combustion of plant biomass dates to the late Silurian, more than 400 million years ago. So fire has been an incredibly potent ecological and evolutionary force in Earth's history. But also very recently, we've been pushing back the period of time in which we know that humans and human ancestors manipulated and used fire. Work by Francesco Berna and others from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa have now documented the presence of in situ combustion deep in these occupied caves more than 1.1 million years ago, and this may well stretch further in our past. So this has an important place in human history and evolution too. And of course, Richard Wrangham, an evolutionary anthropologist from Harvard University, has hypothesized that the use of fire for cooking may have been a really important role in kind of shaping human biology for potentially the last 2 million years. So as Stephen Pine, my colleague and historian at Arizona State University, has put it, we have this actually unique unity on Earth that we have planetary conditions that are suitable for fire, plenty of biomass, plenty of oxygen, plenty of ignition sources, but also that humans are simultaneously these kind of fundamental fire creatures, and this probably played a really important role in shaping our evolutionary history. So to frame research questions as if the only thing that's meaningful to ask is whether or not fires are human or natural, really kind of puts the blinders on and keeps us from asking more meaningful questions. That it's both, and it has been both for a very long time. And I should say, I'm in the exposition now, but please feel free to stop me if you have any questions about anything that I'm pointing out on the slides as I go along. I'm happy to pause. Now, the contemporary fire problem, as we wrestle with it in the Western U.S., but also in other parts of the world, is one in which we view this as a clash of culture and nature, of human values and properties and livelihood with inherently fire-prone landscapes. And we've tended to view this primarily from an ahistorical lens. The role that history has played in this is largely, for the landscapes where this is appropriate anyway, has largely been about documenting the divergence between contemporary fire regimes and historical fire regimes, and that humans have either contributed to that or now are kind of caught in between. But this overlooks the fact that many of these landscapes in the Western U.S., and especially the Southwestern U.S., where I do my work, have been home to human communities for millennia. And these fire-prone settings have posed challenges and opportunities for the ancestors of modern American Indian communities who've called these landscapes home for time immemorial, and on archaeological time for at least the last few millennia, and in some cases at least 13,000 years. And archaeology has a unique place, I think, within this, because we have many decades of experience wrestling with questions about the relationship between human societies and climate change, how human societies have coped with and adapted to climate regimes of different sorts and the dynamics between them. And we have a much better way of thinking about these problems if we integrate the human questions about adaptations to different climate regimes and climate dynamics with the paleoecological and paleoclimatic concerns for the role of climate as providing biophysical controls on fire regime dynamics and changes perhaps in fire severity. And so to do this, I've kind of tried to integrate those concerns in a set of research questions. And so I have those posted on the screen right now. So rather than asking whether or not Southwestern fire regimes are natural, they are, or whether or not people affect them, they do, but to ask how Southwestern forests with people respond to those climate changes in ways that are different than those either without people or probably more appropriately phrased with a lighter human footprint on them. And what can we learn from these histories to improve the resilience of these forests today, or to more specifically improve their sustainability in the context of contemporary climate change that in the Southwest is involving probably increased duration and severity of droughts. Now, these are not traditional archaeological questions by any means, and archaeology alone can't really help us answer these questions. So to try to address these questions well, we need three different data sets to be integrated into an interdisciplinary research program. On the one hand, we need to have a good idea about variation in fire-relevant climate. I'll get to that in a minute. It's more than knowing whether it's warm or cold or dry or wet, but to understand in a temporally explicit fashion how those climate drivers that influence the key properties of the fire regime have changed over time. We need to obviously have some idea about the variation over time and space in human land use, human populations, and we can know this from archaeology, but also from ethnohistory and ethnography, including, of course, how people used or may have used fire in their livelihoods. And then finally, we need some evidence for variation in fire regimes themselves that match up on temporal and spatial scales with the archaeology and the climate reconstruction. And so over the course of this talk, I'm going to describe the data sets that we built together to try to address these questions in eastern Arizona. And to make this a little bit more tractable, I've restricted myself to Southwestern ponderosa pine forest. This is, well, it's an ecosystem that I know well and love, but also happens to be one of the ecosystems with the best characterized fire regimes in the world, thanks in large part to the ability to date fire events using tree rings to the year, and in many cases actually to the portion of the growing season of the tree. So for at least the last few centuries, we know this fire regime very well. Here, I'm just kind of mapped out the broad distribution of ponderosa pine forests in the Southwest and the two study areas, my eastern Arizona study area and my new New Mexico study area. This doesn't include the ponderosa pine forests in the Sky Islands of southern Arizona. And from those tree ring studies, we have a really good idea both about the fire regime and its climate relationships. At least prior to inadvertent and active fire suppression over the last 100, 120 years, in all ponderosa pine, southwestern ponderosa pine stands that have been sampled, we have fires that occur very frequently, every 3 to 15 years, or a more general rule of thumb, every 5 to 10 years. But these are fires of a very specific type. These are fires that burn in surface fuels, like it's depicted in the upper left here, that don't burn into the canopy, and that because of some unique or some specific fire adaptations that ponderosa pine has as a species, including very thick bark to insulate the trunk and self-pruning branches. These trees were able to survive fires once they've grown to a certain height because their canopy is out of the reach of the flame lengths, and that in a few conditions, like on slopes where you might have localized accumulations of fuels or eddying effects as fires move up slope, fires may get hot enough to kill the cambium locally on the tree, and as that bark sloughs off, the tree tries to regrow and heal that scar, and this is what we call a fire scar. And on this figure here in the bottom left, you can see a really great illustration of a tree that has recorded 22 fire scars over the course of a couple hundred years. In terms of the seasonality, we also have a good sense about when during the growing season these happen. These typically happen in the arid foresummer before the monsoonal rains start in early to mid-July. So between the period of time when the moisture from cyclonic winter storms has stopped and snows have melted if there were snows present, but enough time for any understory fuels and grasses to dry out and carry a fire. But also, really importantly, are these interannual relationships between the occurrence of fires and multi-year moisture patterns, particularly those associated with El Nino Southern Oscillation. It looks like in statistical analysis after statistical analysis, fires in these settings occur after multiple wet years in which those fine surface fuels, the grasses and forbs, can grow in sufficient abundance and continuity to be able to carry a fire. And then the fires typically happen in the dry year that follows those. So these patterns of wet, dry correlate really strongly with particularly widespread regional fire years. Now, of course, that's not how fires happen in these settings today. Many of you probably know this well. We see this very unfortunately depicted on the news seemingly every summer for the last few years, where now fires get into the canopy, get into the crown of the forest, and burn over very large areas. In some cases, like parts of the Jemez Mountains that Craig will talk about next week, with such continuity that there are thousands of hectares without a seed source for the trees to return. So these are basically being wiped out from in large patches through these stand replacing fires, these crown fires. And this is an old graph from the increasing representation of crown fires from the Coconino National Forest, and the observant member of the audience will note that it seems to more or less track the global temperature anomaly. And in fact, some people have looked at this and thought perhaps this is symptomatic of global climate change, and maybe this is something that would be happening anyway as a result of anthropogenic emissions and contemporary global warming. But the story is not quite so simple. Those frequent surface fires in the historic period maintained a very open park-like structure. In fact, the ponderosa pine forests historically have been described as parklands, in which the tree density was very low, and the potential to carry fires through the crown was very low. In addition to the difficulty of actually getting the fire, any fire from the ground into the canopy. And I want to kind of illustrate what has to happen to the structure of those forests and the role that climate or land use can play in altering that structure to create this vulnerability to crown fires during severe droughts. So frequent surface fires maintain open, canopied forests. This is a photo from outside of Flagstaff from 1909. You can see that the trees are not particularly densely spaced, that the canopy is relatively high. There's not much in the way of herbaceous vegetation on the ground. This area has already been pretty extensively grazed for a few decades. If you remove those surface fires that would burn along the forest floor, increase the period of time between which those happen, you accumulate fuel on the surface, heavy fuels. And if you also have multiple years of wet conditions, those are kind of ideal for germinating seeds and recruiting a lot of conifers into the understory and ultimately into the canopy. And this is what creates conditions for what we call dog hair thickets, and many of you are probably familiar with those. This is in 1949. All of these young trees, and these two trees here in the middle are the reference points. All of these germinated around the same time during the relatively wet period a couple decades before this, but they're all very small and competing with each other for moisture, as well as competing with the mature trees. You add a few more decades to this, and you can see how they're still stunted in terms of their stem, but they're reaching now into the canopy. At this point in time, these trees are very vulnerable to drought stress because they're all competing with each other for water, but they're also capable of carrying fire from the surface into and through the canopy. So if you add drought conditions to these dog hair thickets, you have conditions for crown fires and continuing carrying or running crown fires. Those often are stand replacing, but if we look at their occurrence over the last few decades, it turns out that when they do return to forest, and sometimes, particularly if there's a seed source nearby, they do return to forest, they don't return to open ponderosa parklands. They actually return to dog hair thickets. So this fires, when they occur in these kind of dog hair thicket conditions, provide opportunities for tipping points and moving from one alternative metastable condition of ponderosa pine forests into others, either a permanent shrub field. This is happening in northern New Mexico, where these fires, particularly repeated fires, are turning some of these landscapes into oak, Gamble's oak shrub fields, or into grasslands or meadows. So we can kind of represent this, and this is a conceptual metaphor using a stability landscape to represent this, and the role that fire and certain types of fire in particular play in maintaining those alternative metastable states. So with the historic, relatively high frequency, low severity surface fire regime that characterized southwestern ponderosa pine forests for the several hundred years before fire suppression in the 20th century, the internal feedbacks basically drove any particular stand represented by the ball towards the bottom of the basin on this landscape. The surface fires as a key ecosystem dynamic were driving the feedbacks for open canopied forests that were very difficult to actually alter to alternative metastable conditions. But if you increase the period of time, and now the specific interval here is not the main point. This is actually something that we're actively investigating. I've thrown out 50 to 75 years since the occurrence of large crown fires in the Southwest seem to happen between 50 and 75 years after late 19th century suppression. You change the topography of that stability landscape, where the feedbacks are different. Now the feedbacks drive movement towards higher density ponderosa pine forests that are more vulnerable, right? The threshold between the alternative metastable conditions are now lower, and it takes less extreme conditions to move a previous ponderosa pine forest into grassland or shrub field conditions. And working within this resilience framework, we can hypothesize that humans might actually provide some enhanced resilience by providing functional redundancy of sorts to the natural ignition source of lightning. Humans are not limited to a particular season in which they can ignite fires, nor are they limited in their ability to put fires where they want fires to be. So if fuels are fragmented such that widespread fires can occur, they can overcome this, if they so choose, with more ignitions, whereas lightning, as far as I know, is pretty agnostic on the subject. So this is kind of the framing hypothesis for this work, is trying to figure out whether or not, over the course of the last millennia, there's evidence that human uses of fire might provide this sort of functional redundancy and resilience during climatic conditions that might have favored crown fires at certain points in time. Now, the first point of order then is to figure out whether or not there were periods of particular vulnerability to altered stand density and crown fires on the basis of climate patterns over that period of time. So to do this, I've taken advantage of those strong relationships between surface fires and ponderosa pine forests, those patterns of wet, dry, so those wet antecedent years that produce the fine fuels, and then the dry fire year, to build a multiple regression model for southwestern climate from paleoprecipitation reconstructions from tree rings. So, and basically using analogous methods to the reconstruction of paleoclimate from tree rings, I've calibrated the paleoprecipitation record with the well-represented fire scar record instead of calibrating tree ring widths to modern climate data. And so I've used basically a 200-year window of greatest sample depth for fire scars to build the model and use that for calibrating an integrated paleoprecipitation reconstruction using Henry Gracino-Mayer's El Malpais precipitation reconstruction for west central New Mexico and the Salzer and Kipmuller paleoprecipitation reconstruction for the southwestern Colorado Plateau that spans about 1,400 years of the latest Holocene. The resultant reconstruction, once it's kind of retransformed, is surprisingly strong. This is a very simple model. There are only 3 variables in this multiple regression. And that for that window between 1700 and 1900, those 3 variables explain about 50% of the variance in the proportion of ponderosa pine forests that burned in a given year. So you can see that in this graph. orange is the predicted proportion of stands burning in a given year. The black is what's actually recorded in the fire scar data. And you'll notice that from 1700 through really about 1880, the relationship's really strong. But after that point, a lot more fires are predicted than actually occurred. And you might ask, well, what happens? And, well, sheep happens. By the 1890s, there were more sheep in New Mexico than there were people. And that, New Mexico was the envy of Wales. Well, I don't know that for sure, but I can imagine so. And the sheep and the cattle were effectively out-competing fire for consuming those fine fuels. And that for much of the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, this is the primary fire suppression effect, is the competition between grazers and fire, and grazers won. But if we look back at the last 1,400 years, here at the top we've got the annual reconstruction. You'll note that, so this is 1748, which is well known as the largest fire year in the fire scar record. That we have a comparable year in the 11th century. But if we look at the variance and how frequent these regional fire years are, and that's what I have plotted here on the bottom. The black line are years in which more than one standard deviation above the mean value were predicted to burn in that year, and the very large years are more than 2 standard deviations. And so this looks at the frequency of these events. I believe this is in a 25-year moving average. And I kind of want to highlight a couple areas here that indicate periods in the 8th century, but also the late 14th and 15th century, when those climate conditions, those frequencies of wet, dry patterns that are really good for widespread surface fires kind of broke down. I don't have a really good explanation for that, but those are indicated here at the top, that there are prolonged, at least fire-free intervals at the regional scale during those windows of time. And this second one is one that's of particular interest to us as archaeologists, because there's a lot that's going on in Southwestern, the Southwestern cultural world in the 14th and 15th centuries. So in other words, that's a period of time in which we would expect that some of the Southwestern forests, and perhaps many of them, were in conditions more like this Model B here, in which there were conditions suitable for increased stand density and maybe greater vulnerability to crown fires. So that gives us something to aim for in terms of evaluating the human contribution to fire regime change over the last 1,000 years. And I've chose to focus in eastern Arizona for a couple of reasons. One, the University of Arizona has a long history of doing research here, but also this was an area that had been burned really severely by what at the time was the largest fire in Arizona's history, the Rodeo Chetasky fire. And this is those two fires very early in their burning. So this was something that had basically some very local importance to the communities that we were working with. But also, from the work of the Forest Service as well as the University of Arizona, we had a good sense of the gradient of land use histories. And so these are indicated here in the sampling locations. These in yellow I mark as controls, and that they've been surveyed intensively by archaeologists, but didn't disclose any evidence for residential architecture. There's some artifact scatters, so they were used, certainly, but not used the same way as the parts of the landscape where people were living. These are basically densities of residential sites. But also a gradient in time. So we have the yellow control watersheds that were never lived in over this last 1,000 years. These central watersheds, Day Wash and Willow Wash, where people lived in these episodically for many centuries, but they depopulated these areas relatively early. And the Forestdale Valley in the east that had a very long prehistoric occupation and was also an important location for Western Apaches when they moved into the landscape. To kind of talk you through what the archaeological history is like, for the Pueblo II and Pueblo III periods, from about 80,000 to 1275 here, this is the period of most dispersed settlement and residential structure. People were cultivating maize, beans, and squash, and living in small hamlets or even small villages. This is one of the largest ones in the Forestdale Valley, the Tafaki ruin, that has maybe a couple dozen rooms and a great kiva. These communities were connected with one another as well as communities on the Colorado Plateau. But to the best of our knowledge, they lived year-round in these ponderosa pine forest settings. Now, after 1275, many of you probably know there's a great population reorganization on the Colorado Plateau. In the Mogollon Rim area here of eastern Arizona, there are populations that move in from northern Arizona. Some of the local populations may also leave. One thing that happens is that the remaining populations and the new populations aggregate into large pueblos. So there are far fewer actual settlements, but they have many more people living in them. And these also seem to be multi-ethnic communities and are pretty unstable. So the one on the left here, Bailey Ruin, that's located at the Day-Wash-Willow-Wash watershed boundary, was only occupied for less than 50 years before it was depopulated, whereas this is a large village in the Forestdale Valley, was occupied all the way until 1400, maybe a little beyond. Now, after 1400, at least until the late 16th century, this is an area that was almost certainly Tierra Despoblada. The Coronado expedition goes just east of here, and his guides refer to this area as a depopulated landscape. They're unaware of anybody living on this landscape. But by the late 16th century, we've got both archaeological and ethnohistorical evidence for Apaches or in the ethnohistoric descriptions, Apache-like peoples living in this area. And there are a number of clan origin locations for Western Apache clans in the vicinity of the study area, particularly around Forestdale Valley. And they're there until the establishment of the reservation in 1870, and the Forestdale Valley is still on the Apache reservation. Our understanding of the use of fire as a tool for ancestral Puebloan peoples is not very precise. We have some hypotheses from the archaeological literature, including from some work by Alan Sullivan, who presented in this series last year, what he refers to as the burn plot hypothesis, or what has come to be known as the burn plot hypothesis, in which he suggested that these types of landscapes, in large part because the soils derived from the sedimentary rocks are relatively nutrient poor, would have benefited from recycling nutrients by burning off understory plants and pine dust to make phosphorus and potassium in particular more available to crops. Now, this is not slash and burn the way we think of that, especially for tropical landscapes, in part because the ponderosa forests were probably very open anyway. But he sees this as a way in which people may have used fire and added additional fire to these landscapes. He's also very recently, or more recently, advocated that other ancestral Puebloan groups, including those in the Grand Canyon area where he works, used burning of understory plant communities to actually promote those disturbance-loving species that produce greens and seeds that were of economic value. Although it's not really clear whether that would have been done after harvest or maybe early in the season to promote a green up. We're not really sure. And ultimately, of course, there's evidence for hunting. And this actually comes from some ethnographic work that suggests that fire was used by some historic Pueblo populations to drive small game as well as large game. with Apaches, we have a much better picture, and a lot of this has been summarized pretty well in Winifred Buskirk's dissertation that was published in the 80s by the University of Oklahoma Press. Some of this is from his own work, some of this is summarized from earlier work. Western Apaches used fire in a variety of ways for agricultural land use, clearing new fields, cleaning irrigation ditches, cleaning up detritus after harvest. They explicitly burnt after harvest to create an ash bed effect, basically recycling those nutrients for the next year. They used it in hunting in a variety of ways. They used it to promote wild seed collecting areas or promote wild tobacco, and even used it to promote resprouting shrubs, so they produce nice straight switches for making baskets. Now, the ways in which fire histories are usually reconstructed are either through tree rings, which are very precise spatially and temporally, but suffer a very serious age attenuation effect. As you saw from that plot I had earlier about the fire scar chronologies that I used, as you go further back in time, beyond, say, 1650, the record starts to get very thin. And so to look at this full 1,000-year record, I wasn't going to be able to use fire scars to be able to do this, especially since the landscape that I was working in had been heavily logged historically. The other way in which paleoecologists have approached long-term fire histories is through sedimentary charcoal studies, basically using charcoal, the byproduct of incomplete combustion of biomass, as a proxy for fire within the sedimentary catchment area. This is often done from lakes, ponds, bogs, or wetlands, which is an environment that is not very common, to make a real serious understatement, in the dry ponderosa pine forests. So to be able to match a fire history record to the appropriate spatial and temporal scales, I adapted sedimentary charcoal techniques and built in a few other fire-related proxy data sets to a different type of sedimentary environment. In this case, looking at the accumulating reaches, what are called alluvial channel fans of discontinuous ephemeral streams, really focusing on the sheet flow reaches of these, where the products of wildfires might be mobilized off of the slopes and transported by streams, and in the sheet flow reach where sediments are accumulating, they'll accumulate with those. That's the idea. And I felt confident that this was a strategy that was likely to work, although the sedimentary environment is certainly much more complicated than in a lake or in a bog, that streams carry, in some cases, large volumes of post-fire erosion products, and that these were places where we would likely expect to see those. So what I did, and I'm a geoarchaeologist by trade, is to walk these drainages, and you can see now probably that these study units are hydrological basins, walking along entrenched streams, clearing off cut banks, describing alluvial and soil stratigraphy, taking a wide variety of samples, including continuous samples for charcoal and some geochemical indicators and other small undisturbed blocks you can see here in these little blue blobs, to make soil thin sections to be able to look at the microstratigraphic context of some of these indicators. And I did this across 4 different watersheds, 2 of which were control watersheds, in which there was no evidence for residential life, but they were undoubtedly used. One with a short occupation, where that Bailey ruin was that I showed you, that was depopulated by 1325, and one with a long occupation, including a long Apache occupation, the Forestdale Valley. I built in some replication, so in the Forestdale Valley, actually I did 3 chronologically overlapping sequences to help improve the chronology, but also to make sure that the proxies were not being affected by the more complex sedimentary dynamics of these stream valleys. And then to make sure that I understood what these proxies meant in relationship to certain types of fire activity, I collected analogous samples from a grading channel fans after the Radiochedovsky fire, but also from a smaller crown fire in the area, the 1974 day burn, to be able to make sure that had an appropriate frame of reference. These were kind of, you can think of these as standard samples. And the proxies that I'm working with from these sedimentary environments include charcoal, but also phosphorus. In these landscapes that are framed by mostly sandstones, mudstones, and shales, these are generally nutrient poor, as I mentioned. Phosphorus is mostly bound up in plant material, and at low temperatures is liberated and remineralizes in the ash. And so this was a way of getting at relatively low temperature combustion independent of the charcoal. Also looked at palynology to reconstruct plant communities and basically the fire impacts. I'm not going to talk about the carbon isotopes today. That's a little bit more complicated record, but this relates a bit to what fuels burned, as well as perhaps seasonality, although that's a little less clear. And then combine those with some sedimentological and kind of post-depositional studies to understand the context and how they were altered, looking at grain size and some other pedologic properties, using soil thin sections, what archaeologists and geologists refer to as soil micromorphology, to see the difference between very quickly accumulating here on the left sections where the bedding structures are preserved, and you can see how charcoal is imbricated within some of these finely laminated beds, to those in which pedogenic processes act to mix samples very quickly after they're deposited, as you can see here on the right, as well as for superposition of features that let us know or allow us to kind of corroborate the chronological reconstructions about the upbuilding of these alluvial channel fans. And I won't show you all of those records because I'd probably put you all to sleep with a bunch of squiggly lines if I did that. But I do want to show you what one of these looks like. This is from the upper reaches of Forestdale Valley. Here you can see a bunch of young ponderosa pines on a very young overflow channel fan. This is the active channel here. I'm standing on top of this terrace, which is where the sequence is from. You can see that the stratigraphy is not particularly impressive. It's characterized by these very weakly expressed alluvial soils that are the ABs or ACB horizons here. These are what we call flue vents or alluvial soils, weakly developed alluvial soils, with some evidence for thicker cumulized growth here at the top and welding of soils here in the middle, indicative of slower accumulation rates. And the first thing that I did is plot all of the data stratigraphically. Here you can see changes in grain size and organic matter. Charcoal I did continuously at 2-centimeter intervals, whereas most of the other data I did episodically, horizon by horizon. You can see the stable carbon isotopes, carbonates, another pedogenic indicator, and phosphorus, one of our fire proxies. And we converted this to time using radiocarbon chronologies. In the Forestdale Valley, I actually used all three locations to build. They had the same soil stratigraphy in these units to build more precise soil dates, to build age depth models, to be able to turn these into time series. And so this is what that looks like as a time series over the last 1,000 years, with time moving from left to right. We have phosphorus concentrations here in the bottom. This is how much phosphorus is present in fresh alluvium today. So how much is moving through the system in the absence of fire. This is charcoal, and this is a proxy from the grain size here on the back of it, so you can see how depositional energy varied. This is all tree taxa aggregated together in green. Yellow are shrubs, and then orange are basically weeds, wildflowers, grasses, and other herbaceous plants. And this zea refers to the pollen from the domesticated zea maize, corn, as we know it. And the way that I looked at this was really in cultural time periods. So in that Pueblo III to Pueblo IV period, from about 1150 to 1400 in the Forestdale Valley, we have occupation. and we kind of have peak accumulations of charcoal, although it is episodic. It's not continuous. We have peak values here that also coincide with the deposition of domesticates, indicating cultivation of domesticates and gardening and farming. Phosphorus also is at its peak. So this kind of corroborates that there's a lot of fire activity, although not necessarily continuous fire activity in this part of the basin in the context of farming. The other part of the pollen assemblage that's really interesting is that this is basically identical to early historic period ponderosa pine forests in the relative breakdown of trees, shrubs, and grasses. So all this fire is not clearing out forest. It's happening in the context of a more or less natural forest. So our interpretation of this is something akin to Al Sullivan's burn plot hypothesis, in addition probably to natural fires happening elsewhere on the landscape. Now, when people leave in 1400 and move elsewhere, there's a decline in charcoal, despite still having good conditions for charcoal deposition, and a decline in phosphorus. So there's less fire happening on the landscape, although there's still fire happening on the landscape. And the pollen assemblage indicates that the plant species aren't really changing, at least the plant communities aren't really changing, although, of course, there's no gardening taking place. So we interpret this really as evidence of what the natural fire regime was like. And in fact, this is very similar to what happens in the last few hundred years in those control watersheds. Now, after the late 1500s, when Apaches are likely in the area, we see a really big change in the plant communities, although these are percentages. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the trees are less abundant. You could have the same impact if those disturbance species become much more common or much more prolific in their pollen production. Interestingly, the charcoal doesn't necessarily change much. Although the phosphorus indicates that there is more fire happening on the landscape. This is a bit of a curiosity unless you think that these fine herbaceous fuels are what's burning. And these produce fewer particulate byproducts. They combust more completely. And that they would actually produce less charcoal. Then you can actually make sense of these three lines of evidence. And in fact, that's consistent with what we know from Apache ethnography. They relied really heavily on those disturbance plants for greens in the spring, a particularly lean period for Apaches, and seeds later in the season. So important that they actually, during the reservation period, would broadcast them, even though these are wild, around their camp so they'd make sure that they had them. So we think this is evidence for a lot of Apache burning, in addition to natural burning. To promote those wild, economically important wild plants. And then, of course, charcoal and phosphorus decline in the very top of the record with fire suppression. So you can kind of plot out those inferences over time. And here we've got the Forestdale Valley in blue with agricultural burning until 1400, a decline to exclusively natural fires when people leave, and then wild plant burning by Apaches before fire suppression here in the end. And this is plotted on top of the precipitation anomaly used in my climate reconstruction. So wet, dry, and these are in standard deviation units. And this is that frequency of regional and in black, and moderate and large regional fire years in gray. So this is the frequency of climate predicted fire activity on the bottom. In the Bailey watershed, we actually lack the early part of the record. It starts off with about a half a meter deposit that's almost identical to the deposit that formed after the 1974 day burn. The 1974 day burn was a crown fire that removed about half the canopy in the watershed, and about half of it was still intact. So it still had quite a bit of pine pollen and pine trees locally, but half of the trees were taken out. Very thick charcoal deposits that were distinctive associated with that, along with some other chemical indicators. And so that record actually starts with evidence of a crown fire. But it didn't take out the forest entirely, and so we have evidence for natural fires in its wake, and then there's some evidence for Apache use and even gardening in the 17th and 18th century, and that before fire suppression in the end of the 19th century. And in those control watersheds, again, we don't have the early part of the record, but the start of the record in the 1400s is accumulation entirely in the absence of a pine forest. This is actually a denuded landscape full of shrubs and weedy species. And pines don't actually show up again until the late 1600s. And so our inference here is actually this experienced a high-severity crown fire in which actually the forest was locally replaced. And it took a few centuries before the forest was able to regenerate there. So these kind of point to, in different settings, right, in the Bailey Ruin watershed and the control watersheds, crown fires that either replaced the ponderosa pine forest or put a hole in it without taking all of it away during the 1400s. And this is actually consistent with our climate model of increased vulnerability to these types of fires with decreasing antecedent fire conditions, followed by a prolonged wet period that allowed for altered stands. Now note that the Forestdale Valley had anthropogenic burning in addition to natural fire through both of those periods. So this is a landscape that did not experience that reduction in fire activity. Only those that were depopulated by 1325 experienced both of these processes and became more vulnerable to crown fire as a result. So the conclusions are that it does look like anthropogenic burning, in addition to natural lightning-started ignitions, may help foster maintenance of the more resilient open canopied pine forests in the context of climate conditions or other conditions that might favor increasing periods of time between fires and altered stand conditions, which seems to provide good evidence that we should be engaged in the kind of prescribed burning program that we are, and may actually need to do more of this if maintaining those type of open canopied forests is our goal. That if that's our goal, restoring the structure of those forests and expecting lightning to do all the ignition work for us, particularly in light of the modern wildland-urban interface expansion, that may be unreasonable. The forest may be too fragmented to be able to carry fires from lightning ignitions alone, and we may need to supplement it to do that. But of course, the situation's never quite so simple, and there's a lot of evidence from areas as disparate as California and sub-Saharan Africa for nonlinear relationships between population density and fire, that as population densities get higher, you actually have a decrease in fire activity as the human landscape fragments the natural one. You can see this here in Africa too, where people are using this for their livelihoods. As the population density gets higher, both in terms of the number of fires in the area burned decreases. So the next stage for us is actually to look at an ancient wildland-urban interface in the southern Jemez, where in an area that's smaller than my eastern Arizona study area, we have an order of magnitude larger population prehistorically, probably using fire much the same way, but we're curious as to whether or not in this landscape with these very large pueblos, any one of these is as large as the entire population of my Mogollon Rim study area, had inadvertent suppression effects. Now, these are living at high elevation. They needed a lot of fuel for heating their homes, as well as timber for building their homes, and land for growing crops. And maybe there were inadvertent fire suppression effects that made parts of this landscape more vulnerable. We don't know. That's one of the hypotheses driving our research. And so that's what we're investigating now. And I want to leave you, to bring a close to this, with an anecdote from Southwestern ethnography that is kind of a side note in the ethnographic work of Leslie White among the Acoma Indians in western New Mexico. In the 1930s, I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, Leslie White was at Acoma, and we have the great fortune that he happened to be there for a particular Kachina ceremony that he called Turatza Lights the Fires. This is a ceremony that only took place every 5 to 10 years. This was organized by the Corn Clan, and they met at the beginning of July or the end of June to decide whether or not it was an appropriate year to do this. And then within the following week, they would organize young masked Kachina impersonators to go in the cardinal directions from the Pueblo as far afield as 20 kilometers from the Pueblo and light fires on the landscape and light them all the way back to the Pueblo, in which they would have a big community festival. And a few years later, he wrote up the oral tradition that describes the origin for that particular Kachina ritual, and he described it thus. At some point in time in the kind of legendary past, the leaders of the Corn Clan came across Suratza, this Kachina spirit, and 3 of his compatriots, setting fires out near Grants, New Mexico, near not too far from the El Malpais basalt flows. And the Kachinas were concerned that they might misinterpret what they were doing. So they said, wait. Now, we're not doing this to destroy the earth. We're doing this to heat it up, to make it more productive. And this immediately resonated with the leader of the Corn Clan, because he invited Suratza and the other Kachinas to come live at Acoma Pueblo, and in fact to assume the leadership of the Corn Clan, because he thought this was so important. And for a time they lived there, but they ultimately had to go back to their mountain homes, and so the Corn Clan was responsible for maintaining this. And this indicates, in large part because of the scale of this, if for no other reason, that knowledge of fire, its ecological context, its frequency, its seasonality, right, were intimately known by the people who lived on these landscapes for many generations. Right? They understood this very well. And although, even in my talk, we've treated this in a very kind of functionalist way, those types of kind of functionalists and spiritual, symbolic divisions were not so contrastive for the peoples who lived there at the time, and as well as for their descendants. And it's entirely possible that by expecting there to be any difference at all, we're missing a big part of the human and fire relationship. So I think we have a long way to go to work with Native peoples and continue to kind of build our relationships with the archaeological past, the oral traditions about the past, paleoclimate and paleoecological and paleofire records, to learn everything that we can from millennia of human experience in these fire-prone settings to try to live in the best way that we can with these types of fire-prone forests in an era of climate change ourselves. So I want to thank you guys for your time. Sorry I went a little bit over, and I'm happy to entertain any questions if you guys have any.
Wow, Chris, thanks for a very interesting talk. There's lots there to think about. Do we have any questions or comments? No questions? No comments? Chris, I wanted to ask you about the wet, dry intervals
Yes.
that you were speaking of prehistorically. Is this related to El Niños?
Yes. Well, so one of the challenges for understanding the origin for that anticipated decline in surface fire activity in the 14th and 15th century is that most El Nino reconstructions, because at least in the more recent past, for the last 300 or 400 years, it's definitely related to El Nino, absolutely. But on longer time scales, the reconstructions of El Nino are kind of all over the place. So some reconstructions have a really high amplitude variation in El Nino La Nina switching during that period of time, which would, I would expect, actually drive more frequent surface fires, because it would be really good for producing fuels and very good for producing the kind of dry years suitable for spreading fires. Others indicate maybe a weakened El Nino amplitude during that period of time, which would align a little bit more with what we see here. certainly in the annual reconstruction, what is driving that change is that there is a reduction in the year-to-year variation of moisture on a more decadal time scale.
Okay. Thanks for that. What are your future plans?
Yeah, so we've done 3 years of field work in the Jemez Mountains now, and now my grad students and I are furiously working on the samples. We're doing much of the same kind of work, although we have probably twice as many localities across that landscape, some of which have much longer records. I have a 40,000-year record of very localized fire and vegetation history from the Banco Benito rhyolite flow in the Valles Caldera National Preserve. That includes some evidence for heightened fire activity during the human occupation in the last few hundred years. That may also be associated, in that case, with agricultural use. Thus far, it actually looks like that our hypothesis about inadvertent fire suppression in the denser ancient wildland-urban interface may not be correct.
Really?
It could, yeah. It looks like in the areas, at least where I've got complete data so far, or at least maybe it's more complicated. That's what I should say. In these kind of agrarian landscapes, there's a lot of fire associated with evidence for agriculture, including ZMAs, pollen, and the pollen assemblies. Lots and lots of fire happening on those landscapes. So it looks a bit like the kind of burn plot hypothesis. But then in areas that are a little bit more residential, there's very little evidence for fire. And so it looks like there may be a mosaic, although we haven't found clear evidence yet about what the impacts of that mosaic were. We have a big modeling component. Rachel Lohman is one of the co-PIs on this. She's with the USGS now in Alaska, and she's a dynamic ecological modeler. And so she's trying to take the information that we have and scale it up, because we have these kind of watershed scale data points, and really the consequences of this might play out in more complicated ways at the landscape scale. So she's modeling forest dynamics and fire dynamics under different types of land use and climate conditions to see if we can kind of tune those towards our paleoecological information to figure out, okay, what likely actually happened? What would be the consequences on the larger landscape of this kind of mosaic of suppressed fire here and enhanced fire there?
I was wondering if there was any way to, if you're able to sort of tease out when you have low, other than the density of charcoal, are there ways to determine whether or not you've got like a low density fire versus something that's very intense?
Yes. So,
I mean, in the archaeological, I know, I just listened to your talk, but I mean in the archaeological record, is there any way to tell, like, whether or not they're, like, burning their fields off versus something more extensive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One way that I've tried to get at that is by focusing on the stable carbon isotopes of the charcoal fraction itself. ZMAs is a C4 plant. It uses a relatively young photosynthetic pathway that is less discriminating against the heavier forms of carbon and CO2. So it shows up distinctly in the ratio of the stable carbon isotopes. So far, I haven't seen that, and it could be because I'm not sampling fields directly themselves, or that by mass, the vast majority of the charcoal is still coming from the C3 pine forest, that it's kind of swamping out the relatively low biomass signal from the corn. That is a part of the story that we're still kind of working on. There is another way to get at fire intensity. I'm working with a colleague, Andrew Scott, who's on this thank you slide, and who's, in fact, it's his slide that I've stolen for the backdrop here, this really cool flower. He's a geologist who has been working with his students and postdocs over the last couple of decades, adapting a microscopy technique from coal petrology for reconstructing the combustion temperature of charcoal using its reflectance, its quantitative reflectance under a very narrow wavelength of visible light in oil microscopy. And so that basically, the higher the temperature, the more light gets reflected back. The cell walls become increasingly homogenized, and they reflect more light back. And so actually one thing that we're doing on the New Mexico project is making thin sections, polishing them, and then doing reflectance measurements of the charcoal in situ on those blocks. I don't have any results to tell you about that other than to say that we've done some work from contemporary fires to make sure that this works in wildfire settings the way it does in experimental settings, and it does. It does seem to work.
So if you're burning off agricultural fields, then you would have a lower fire.
Yeah, you'd expect those to be lower temperatures.
Okay, temperature fire, and you would expect to see it reflected in this set of analyses.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, do we have any more questions? Any comments? All of our fire people on the line here?
Christopher, this is Jim Kendrick. I just want to thank you for a great presentation and really interesting work out there.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Jim, you used to work in the Southwest, didn't you?
I did. I was the archaeologist at El Malpais National Monument, and and I went to school at SMU.
Oh, hey.
Yeah.
Well, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year.
I know. It's fantastic.
Yeah. If you get a chance, my colleague here in the department, who also happens to be my better half, is organizing our departmental Facebook page to spread the word about the 50th anniversary and sharing all sorts of great photos of students and faculty from years past too. Come like us on Facebook if you're on Facebook.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
One of our colleagues who is very supportive of the webinar series, Palin Yu, is also an alumni of MSU or SMU.
SMU.
Yes. So anybody else? Any other comments?
Christopher, this is Jim again. You mentioned the prescribed burning strategies that we currently have in place. What I was most concerned with out west was not so much the prescribed burns themselves, but doing them when the fuel loading seemed to be at abnormally high levels. And another thing that is just kind of a comment that I noticed out there in the archaeology is that I rarely saw fire effects on any of the archaeological assemblages. And I was wondering if you noticed that too, and if that gives us any indication of I guess, fire regimes or intensity and such. Probably not as much as the fire scars, but it always interests me that I rarely saw any fire effects on archaeological assemblages.
Yeah, that's a really great point. A colleague of mine who's the director of heritage research and archaeology for the Valles Caldera, Anna Steffen, and Rachel Lohman are working on a project doing some experiments partly related to fuel loads and burn intensity actually in the Jemez. Their project is called, I think, the ArcBurn project. To explore this a little bit in at least contemporary landscape fuel settings to understand what consequences, well, for one thing, contemporary fire management strategies might have on cultural resources, but also maybe to better understand why very often we have not seen fire effects. I think it may be, I mean, depending on what the resource context is like. And one thing that we're learning from the fire scar work we're doing in the Jemez is that there's very little fuel on top of those large pueblos to burn. We don't see evidence for spreading surface fires again for usually about 40 to 50 years after depopulation. And those are still probably only happening in relatively light fuel loads. And I think that's probably an important part of that, is that when fires happen in the past on at least many of these residential sites, they're probably happening in very light fuel loads, so that they were probably burning over very quickly and at relatively cooler temperatures. Whereas now, you're right, the fuel loads are really, really high. So in the Jemez, they've done some real serious fuel management in advance of a recent prescribed burn that burned really hot. So it ended up producing very heavy and relatively coarse, thick fuel loads on the surface that smoldered in a way that duff and grassy fuels don't. And I think that's actually where some of the arc burn study locations were. So I think there'll be some really interesting information to come out of that. I know that in terms of post-fire erosion, oh my gosh, last summer was epic. One of my localities was just downstream from there, and it was totally transformed by head cutting and really massive deposition of these kind of drapes of charcoal-rich fan deposits.
You've had a pinyon die-off up there too, right?
Yes.
Or are you too?
Well, we're kind of
too high for
above that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Well, very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.